What we do here is go back.
And we're back.
And we're back.
With another episode of
Wait, James. They might not know who we are yet.
Oh, right. This is a promo. Well, I'm James.
And I'm Matt.
And together, we're the Bros and Brews podcast.
We're coming at you every week with worldly discussions, an art meets life questions podcast.
What 3 albums would you take to a deserted island?
How comfortable are you with sex and sexuality?
Is it ethical to have children?
What actually makes a great actor?
We use our personal experiences, the craft of acting, and pop culture as a springboard to discuss everything.
From uncomfortable truths, demonized issues, and problems often swept under the rug.
But don't worry, we have fun along the way.
Come join us for our weekly check-in.
And we'll see you next time.
Peace!
This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. Thanks to all of our patrons at any level for your support. We really couldn't do this without you. Now let's get into the interview. In this episode, I talked with Jim Ward about myths about homelessness, how to respond to people experiencing homelessness, and what we can do to solve the problem. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Jim Ward. He has been working to end homelessness for the last 10 years. He currently works with the Texas Homeless Network, planning the response to homelessness in 215 out of 254 Texas counties. Welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lucas.
Yeah, this is a topic that I've wanted to talk about. We talk about things that people avoid, and homelessness and homeless people is something that a lot of people tend to avoid and probably avoid talking about and just try to ignore it. And as we'll probably get into, seems to also be kind of the policy of a lot of cities and government entities and how to deal with homelessness. But first, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up working in this area.
Yeah, definitely. So I actually began this work as I was, kind of preparing for this interview, thinking back around my career, I guess you could say, in 2008. So I started working at the Austin Resource Center for the Homeless, which is the local emergency night shelter for single men in Austin, Texas. It serves anywhere from between 175 to 200, 225 men, single men, on an emergent basis. And that was my first experience, both with homelessness and kind of a delve into the underside of like what the safety net looks like in practice. And so I mentioned that I worked overnight. So I was working overnight from Friday night to Sunday. I would get off actually on Monday morning at 6 a.m. and then I would sleep all day on Monday and then go to class Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then repeat that cycle over and over and over and over. And
wow. Yeah, that's intense.
And one of my, it was, but it was, I think that the experiences of the folks that I was working with, it was like talk about an exercise in gratitude. I mean, like I I would get off on Monday mornings and like just literally go home and fall in bed and be able to sleep until I'd wake up a little bit later on that day and do some studying. I was going to school for social work at the time, and at ACC, before I transferred to the University of Texas. But part of my role, and I think that like that role, like that job specifically, was really important for me in the formation of how I kind of view homeless services and the social service net, safety net, if you will. Because one of the functions that I had was we would do a nightly lottery for the beds that existed in this shelter. So what that meant was we would go into a garage, an enclosed area that was, controlled access area where men had been kind of like gathering throughout the afternoon for a lottery that would happen every night at 6:15. And so these guys would have to stop whatever it is they were doing and come down over here to the homeless shelter and sit in a garage with a bunch of other guys that may or may not be, focusing on the same things that they're focusing on. They may be intoxicated. They may be experiencing a mental health crisis. They may have like had to leave work early, or they may be looking for a job, right? Like any number of things that these people were experiencing. They'd have to stop whatever it was they were doing and come to this garage. And so my role was really to hold a bucket full of folded paper numbers, and guys would walk by this bucket and they would pull a number out of the bucket. And then there would be a colleague standing next to me, and they would unfold this number and they would show it to the colleague. And then depending on what number it was, like if it was a number less than 100, the person standing next to me, or sometimes that person was me, would actually sign the back side of that ticket. And that would essentially ensure that person had a place to stay for the night. Right. So all the guys that came through that line and picked a number out of that bucket, and it was 130 or 180 or whatever the number was, it was just like undesirable because it wasn't going to get you a place to stay. You could you could just see all the, like, what hope existed in their face for that day would just wash away almost instantly. And it was kind of then that I learned, I think, that the service delivery model that exists still to this day in some instances, it was just deeply flawed. It was based on this essentially random luck, if you will, in this instance. But in general, it's kind of based around this first come, first serve, which still owes a lot to luck, idea of how services should be allocated. And so I did that for a while, and then it was not ever something that you could ever really get comfortable with, with that process. There's a lot more to the job than just that. And I really cherish the relationships that I was able to build with the guys that I, stay in contact with to this day. Because it was definitely about a lot more than just that process, and like getting to know people, getting to follow like what they're working on. And totally, like when you think about the American ideals, like this rugged individualism, and guys really scrapping hard to try to get something together to get out of the situation they were in. It was really inspiring in a lot of ways for me. Previous to working in this environment, I had done a lot of different things. I had gotten a certificate as an emergency medical technician and worked in one of the local emergency rooms here in Austin for a number of years. I had done, pool construction. I had done commercial construction. I was a union iron worker for a while, but nothing that I have done really allowed me to build the kind of relationships that I was able to build, except for homeless services. And that's a really selfish kind of a thing, but I do believe that like there has to be something that keeps people coming back, right? Like, and for me, one of the things that helps me keep coming back is being able to recognize those small wins in other people and celebrate those wins. And so so that was like my first introduction to homeless services. I actually worked at the Arch for almost 8 years, and moved through various roles in that environment. One of the other things that I did that was formative for me in terms of how I view services was as I was, trying to figure out what I'm doing with school. I had just gotten accepted to UT, and a position opened up at a brand new project at the Arch that, like, whenever you would talk to people about it, they're like, "Oh, did you hear about this new thing that we're doing?" And like people were like really divided about it. And what that thing was a housing first, permanent supportive housing. And so what that means is the Arch was looking to provide long-term rental assistance and voluntary supportive services to homeless folks. And the target population for this project was those that were most frequent users of the Arch's emergency services. So these are guys that were either coming to the Arch every night to try to get a bed, or actually, regardless of whether or not they were staying there the majority of the time, or they were having to go sleep outside, or whatever their case might be. It was really based on like entries into this emergency shelter situation. And so I applied for the job as a case manager for this project, and they gave it to me, which I was kind of shocked about. I mean, I don't know why, looking back, like I feel like I have my heart and head are in the right place. So, but at the time I was in my, early to mid 20s, I think. And so it was just kind of like mind blowing to me that people were going to give me this, like, trust me with this kind of responsibility. And so the key thing about Housing First is that the services are voluntary, right? And so that's in direct opposition to the long held beliefs about how people both in homelessness and also in poverty should be provided or should be assisted. The old, I would say the quote unquote old way of thinking, at least in my experience, has been that like homelessness and poverty is primarily an issue of morality and like personal failure. And what Housing First really, the difference there, I think, with Housing First and a quote unquote housing ready model, which is kind of what, the old way of thinking about things, where someone would have to go through like an emergency shelter and then go to transitional housing and demonstrate progress. And then from transitional housing, they might go to a time limited rental assistance project. And then from there, they will either be exited to rent housing, like market housing, or maybe they'll get really lucky and get like a housing choice voucher from the housing authority or something that allows them to sustain long term. And I think the difference between that way of providing services and Housing First is really, Housing First is like walking through someone's experience with them, and recognizing that we're all experts in our own lives, right? Like I don't know what someone should be doing any more than I know like what I should be doing, and that really comes from like a lot of personal introspection and like and my values and my beliefs, et cetera. And so like part of my job as a housing case manager in this role was like finding out what motivates people and like how do we help you achieve your goals in a way that is in a way that it's like client led, if you will, or person centered. Yeah. And that was like when the light bulb went off for me, and when I was able to kind of recognize what my role was in that space. And so, yeah, I did that for a while, and at some point, the executive director of the Arch saw fit to give me control of the entire program, and so that was a really interesting experience, because it's very different. Like managing and administering homeless programs is very different from like carrying out the direct service work that happens in homeless services. Yeah. Because you're caught between executive management and direct service staff. You're caught between the funder and the agency. Like there's all these competing priorities, and but I really enjoyed it. And we grew that program. We doubled the size of that program in about 2 years. And I was at that time I was asked to come over to another agency in Austin, which is Caritas of Austin, and help them navigate housing first in their existing program structure. And I won't get too far into that, but just with the understanding that housing first is at this point a nationally recognized best practice as it relates to how we address housing and services for people experiencing homelessness. From the federal perspective, which is where the majority of my work focuses now, it really should be a system orientation, right? So you can't actually have a housing first project, if you will, without like a housing first system orientation. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of get stuck spinning your wheels. And I recognize that how that was happening both at the Arch and at Caritas now from where I sit. But it really is a massive shift in the way that services are provided. And you can kind of see that now in Austin. I would say like the biggest, to me, kind of like visible indicator of the system starting to shift is, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's the repeal of the camping ordinances and the no sit, no lie ordinances. Like those are at their heart a person-centered move. They may feel political, they may seem political, but at their heart, like the intention there is to decriminalize the experience of being homeless, which will in turn make it easier to exit that experience. And so it's a really interesting, like when you can look at housing first from like a systems level, it's really interesting to see how things kind of play together that don't when you look at them independently. So that's kind of what I'm doing now is I do policy for the Texas Homeless Network. I'm not here on behalf of the Texas Homeless Network, by the way. I'm speaking for myself. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, back up a little bit, Jim. I'm interested to hear what did you growing up, like what did you learn or hear or maybe just absorb about homelessness and homeless people? Kind of what did you learn about that growing up?
Yeah, that's a really that's a good question. So I've lived in Austin. Now I live in Hayes County now, but I've lived in and around Austin my entire life, and so I've definitely seen a visible shift in terms of like what homelessness quote unquote looks like. Like I will say that the visible homelessness is not the extent of homelessness, right? There are tons of folks that are experiencing housing instability that are either doubled up, couch surfing, living in motels, right? Like all these different experiences that people don't see. What people see, underneath the overpass at Ben White and 35 is just a microcosm of the experience of homelessness. And so I think when I was growing up, I mean, to be perfectly honest, there wasn't a ton of, at least in my experience, of visible homelessness in Austin. I have this distinct recollection of my mother and I. So I grew up in this. My mom raised me. I grew up in a single parent household. She, she actually was also an emergency medical technician. And looking back, like I have no idea how she was able to hold it all together on that pay and getting all the things done that we needed to get done, but she did. But I have this recollection of her and I going to the Super Salad that was, and for listeners, Super Salad, there's a Super Salad buffet restaurant. It's literally just soup and salad. It's pretty great. If you've never been to one, I would highly encourage you to check it out. But we were going to the Super Salad. It was there at Ben White and Lamar here in Austin, Texas. And a guy approached us and asked us for money in the parking lot. And I want to say I couldn't have been any more than 10 years old. And I had a $5 bill in my pocket. And my mom was like, "No, we can't give you any money." And I reached in my pocket and gave this guy $5. And I was like, you can come eat with us now. I told him that. I was like, now you can come eat with us. And he was like, "Oh, no, that's okay." And like took off. And I didn't understand that. But what I did understand was that like when I give something, it's like without condition, You know what I mean? Like, and that was something that my mom taught me, is that, and I think that goes a long way with like my support of like housing first model and like mutual aid models and like, you know, horizontal power structures in general, is that like how I interface with people that are experiencing homelessness, like it can't be based on like what I think they should be doing. And I've known that from a really young age. I'll also say, right, like that a lot of the principles that can be found in I think in 12-step programs can be applied to a wide variety of life circumstances, right? Like what people are doing is really none of my business unless it impacts me. So like if I give somebody $5 and they don't want to come eat lunch with me, they would rather go, you know, have a beer or whatever, like that's what they need to do. And it is what it is. You know?
Yeah. You mentioned a couple times this like idea of people thinking that they know what homeless people should do, you know, both like working in shelters and the model of kind of what you think is going to work for people. And you mentioned earlier approaching the different people that you were interacting with and building relationships with as if you didn't know what they needed to do. You needed to become an expert in that particular person to try and understand their motivations. And I think a lot of people have these ideas of what they think people should do or have to do, or as if they already know the solutions for homelessness without maybe even knowing anybody in particular that's homeless. What are some of those myths that people have about, you know, if you would just do this, or those shoulds about homelessness that people think are the answers or are the solutions?
Yeah.
What are some of those? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I think
there's a lot of, I think there's probably a lot of them. So maybe that's a big question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a ton of them. I think like,
what are your top three maybe?
Sure. I think that there are, so I think that there are myths around structures and there are myths around individuals, right? Like I think that some of the stereotypes and myths that I hear around individuals are that like people experiencing homelessness are lazy, right? And people in poverty and people experiencing homelessness are some of the most profoundly hardworking people that I've ever met in my life. Like it's not cheap to be poor, right? It's not cheap access to banking is an issue for a lot of folks. I mean, when you think about, insufficient fund fees, like you don't have any money, we're going to take $35 from you because you don't have any money. And like what kind of cycles that can create, right? Access to transportation, I think, is a huge issue that kind of like contribute potentially to people feeling like homeless folks or people experiencing homelessness are lazy. That one is just really tough for me because I've lived paycheck to paycheck. I've lived loan to loan in some cases. And it's just so painfully obvious to me, like how expensive it is to actually be poor and or be homeless. When you don't have access to a way to, keep food refrigerated or heat food up, for example, like you're constantly flirting with foodborne illness, right? And one episode of foodborne illness is either going to put you down for a week or potentially send you to the hospital, which then is going to rack up more bills and or less work. And so I think that one is one that I see a lot. I'm also on the board of a local nonprofit called the Other Ones Foundation, and we provide extremely low barrier employment options. So basically, we anyone that wants to work can work, right? Like generally, there are some barriers to accessing work, even for those that like have no criminal history and are like ready to work. You have to have your social security card, your birth certificate. You got to be able to like supply HR with all that I-9 documentation before they're going to let you set foot on a job site and start earning money. And what we've said is we'll navigate that for the short term by, and this is, I'm getting it kind of off topic here, but we'll navigate that by bringing you on as an independent contractor, and then having someone assigned to your case that will help you navigate those things that you need to get your Social Security card, your birth certificate, your ID, so that we can then bring you on as a paid employee, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just the stereotype. I mean, like, I just don't know how I don't know how folks can think that people in poverty and homelessness are lazy, but I do know that that is a stereotype that exists. That I think some of the others, I mean, there's the really painfully, obviously false ones, like all homeless people are drug addicts or have severe mental illness. And again, I think that the visible homelessness that we all see, outside under overpasses contribute to that myth and that stereotype. But again, those folks are like a small fraction of the total number of people experiencing homelessness. For example, in the state of Texas right now, or at the last point in time count, there were about 25,000 people in the state experiencing homelessness.
Wow.
And so those 25,000 are certainly not represented by the people underneath the overpasses and sleeping unsheltered. I think another myth that I hear frequently are that there are people that choose to experience homelessness. And that I think that it's important to remember that, like, homelessness is primarily an issue of housing affordability. Certainly there are contributing factors that will add to someone's experience of housing instability, like substance abuse or mental illness or criminal history or credit issues or general debt or lack of employment or underemployment or child support orders, or like all these things, right? That when you add them up, at some point people are just going to kind of give up. At some point people are going to accept a lot maybe that they didn't intend or ever think that they would be forced to deal with. And so I would say that I have never met, and I can say this with confidence, I have never met a single person that thought that has, you think to a kid, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I've never met someone that was like, I thought I would be homeless.
Yeah.
Like, I just never did.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think that stereotype is particularly harmful, because then it allows us to turn a blind eye and say, oh, well, they're doing what they want to do. And the reality is that they're doing what you see them doing because the system at large has failed.
Yeah. A lot of the things that you've mentioned, and this has come up in other topics and other episodes, things like drugs and mental health. I mean, even when that is related to why someone is homeless or what they're struggling with, we, along with this idea of them being lazy and blaming individuals for their circumstances so that we don't have to wrestle with how to help people, we tend to treat it as, like you were saying, moral failure. And instead of a health issue or, addiction and recovery issue, where there are things that we know that work to try and help people, support around them that can help with all of those issues that people are having, if they are having those issues. I don't know how to. It's something that is frustrating, not just in this particular topic, but that we tend to view a lot of these issues as moral failures of other people, and maybe it just makes us feel better, right? Because because then we don't have to do anything about it, and we really don't have to even worry about it. We can say, well, maybe these do-gooders like Jim are going to try and help people, but I mean, those people are just hopeless. So, good for Jim, but really he's wasting his time is really what I feel like a lot of people think about issues like this.
Right. Yeah. And further, because it's a waste of time, why do we fund that? Like, why do we as a society say that access to substance abuse treatment is important if people just relapse, right? Yeah. Or why are mental health, local mental health authorities funded if people won't maintain a treatment regimen? And then it's like that just moves the ball another 10 yards in the opposite direction.
Right. Yeah.
It's like we're not funding housing, we're not funding services. What we're essentially with all, and I think you probably heard this on other podcasts that you've done, like the largest mental health provider in the United States is the criminal justice system, right? So I would also say it's probably the largest housing provider as well, right? Like the criminalization of homelessness is I think the end result of being able to turn a blind eye and really look at it as more of a moral failing or an individual failing than a structural a structural failing.
Yeah. And so you mentioned this housing first model, which from everything I've read as well, and you can share maybe some resources for people to read about it, it is an approach that has a lot of success. Could you go into a little bit, maybe just thinking through like an individual case? Why is that approach? And you sort of touched on this earlier when you were talking about why moving people from emergency shelter to transitional housing and all along the way, these steps toward, that's how I think most people think about the process for someone going from homelessness to being more stable and having housing. So maybe in a little more detail, compare and contrast why that model is less successful, and this idea of starting with giving someone stable housing has been proven to be a lot more successful.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think one thing I do want to be clear about is, and when we're talking about significantly more successful versus treatment, so we'll call that stair step model the treatment first or the housing ready approach.
Okay.
When you're thinking about the housing ready approach, it's not that approach in and of itself is significantly less successful than housing first, in the sense that we're talking about different like housing retention rates of 80% versus 90%, right? Like 8 out of 10 people versus 9 out of 10 people. I mean, that's not, in the short term, it's statistically significant, obviously, but maybe not obviously, but it could be statistically significant, but is it really worth like the retooling of the whole system? And I think the big difference between the treatment first approach versus the housing first approach, beyond like this individual choice and like client-centered service delivery, is really one of the main things, in my opinion, is the cost. Emergency shelter beds, for example, are significantly more expensive to operate than a apartment. No big surprise there, right? Like transitional housing beds are in a facility are significantly more expensive to operate than an apartment. So I think one of the main things, and one of the things that I kind of lean on, is this cost savings to the community, specifically around the treatment itself, right? If we're talking about how much, $40,000 a year to serve someone in treatment first approach versus $10,000 a year to serve someone in a housing first approach, in my mind, it's an automatic no-brainer. Let's explore housing first more. I think one of the things that we kind of get into is that this idea of like, a friend of mine calls it mean dad economics, right? It's like do as I say, not as I do kind of a thing. And it really is more about like the morality of why people, it doesn't really matter that there's a, 70% in some instances cost savings between housing first and treatment first. It matters that people aren't taking care of their recovery to other people, right? It matters that people aren't taking care of their mental health. And I think that the difference is that with housing first, we're really saying like, let's stabilize you and then let's work on those things. And so that's really the main difference, at least in my opinion, between the housing first and the treatment first. There's obviously the cost issue, and then just the order of operations really are the main differences. No one is saying, like, one of the things that has kind of gotten watered down about housing first, and I could probably do like an entire podcast about housing first specifically. But one of the things that's really gotten watered down, so the model was created back in like the 80s, early 90s in New York. Dr. Samson Barris, who worked at Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital, found that his psychiatric patients did much better whenever they were put immediately into an apartment versus going through a psychiatric rehab model, and then kind of applied that same thought process to people experiencing homelessness, right? And so, but one of the things that's gotten watered down, and I think it's kind of gotten housing first a bad name, is how it's been operationalized at the agency level. Housing first is not housing only, right? One of the things that people get tripped up about housing first is they get someone into an apartment and then they're like, look at all the success we've made, and this person's going to be this person's going to do great from here on out. And like the reality is, you just put someone into an apartment that hasn't lived inside in probably multiple years, and maybe has never actually used a cell phone, or has never doesn't know how to operate a digital antenna for their television, or maybe doesn't even have one, so they can't even watch TV in their home, right? Like there's all these things that need to happen after that, in addition to the addressing whatever contributing factors existed. And so what happens whenever someone forgets the supportive services in the housing first model is that you just end up warehousing people, and they don't thrive in their housing, right? And so then they either get evicted, or they're getting multiple lease violations. Their neighbors are like, why are they moving all these homeless people into my apartment complex, right? Like it turns ugly really quickly. And so I think that housing first is great when it is done to fidelity to the way that the model was intended to operate. So that is like, people are, the services are voluntary for the participant, but they're not voluntary for the agency, right? Like the agency that's providing the services is ethically bound to ensure that they're providing the services that people need to be successful in their apartments. And I think that's one of the breakdowns that has occurred over the last probably 10 to 15 years in this, and in the sense that it really makes it it contributes to lower housing retention rates, people failing to thrive. It contributes to people being exploited and victimized in their units, which often come with police activity and crime, and then it makes it really easy for people that believe or subscribe to the treatment first approach to point the finger at housing first and say, see, housing first doesn't work. And so I think that there's a lot of work that, as a quote unquote industry, which is there definitely is a homeless industrial complex. Like if we're I hate to even quote Alex Jones, but I know he's called it that before. But
you're the first guest to quote Alex Jones. That may live in infamy. I'm sorry to tell you, but a broken clock is right twice a day. That's I guess.
Right. Yeah, that is right. I mean, but the reality is that there is a cottage industry that's built up around homelessness, and I think that service providers, a lot of that is owed to the failings of service providers throughout the years. Both to fully grasp like what the charge is, and then adapt and execute like what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. You mentioned the story you growing up where you had this encounter with a homeless person asking for money. And I think a lot of people have had that experience, once or multiple times, or, they pulled up to a stoplight in the U.S. This is probably maybe even more common, and somebody's there with a sign, and you kind of have to struggle with do I look at them? What do I do? Do I look for some change, or, and a lot of people are just trying to go about their day and don't want to be bothered. And I've had some of those encounters as well. And I know that a lot of people, that do struggle with, well, what do I do? How do I respond when I see people, have different, I've heard lots of people, you've probably heard all of these, like different takes on, well, I never give them money, and I give to the programs that can help them. And so I'm not going to give them because they're going to spend it on drugs or alcohol or whatever. And I distinctly remember a moment where I decided personally, as you were kind of saying, that's just not a very humane approach to giving, or how to respond to people when we do encounter people. So I kind of wanted to hear from you what do you recommend to people when they do encounter homeless people? What are the things that they can do, or how they can respond to people? Maybe not prescriptively, that it's always the right thing to do, or this is the one way to approach it, but some recommendations for, best things that we can do when we run into people, whether it's at a stoplight or, downtown. How should we respond?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that. I think that it's as nuanced as the situations that you might find yourself in. One of the things that I think that we could do better about in this country is recognizing mental health issues, right? There's your local mental health authority if you live in the United States, has a program called Mental Health First Aid, which I think is really important for bystanders to at least be able to recognize the signs of someone that is struggling with mental health issues. I think the other I feel like that comes into play when you're approached on the street, right? Like there was something in the news just the other day about a parent taking their child back or their young adult to UT for their freshman year of college, and walking into the university co-op on the drag here in Austin, and being approached by someone that was aggressively soliciting them for I don't recall exactly what, but that whole interaction got really ugly, was in the news, and probably could have been avoided if there had been, I think, maybe more recognition of mental health concerns, and also just a more deep understanding from the general public of like, we're not all coming to this from the same place. Like you're taking your kid to UT, a $20,000 a semester institution or whatever it is now. And this guy is living outside behind the co-op bookstore, right? And all have very different experiences, and you almost have to modulate how you interact with someone based on their experience, if that makes sense. So I find that's something that helps me a lot. Especially, I think people just kind of have this, clutch your pearls reaction to people experiencing homelessness, especially someone that's been living outside for an extended period of time, or any period of time, really, right? Like that is a very like kind of can be an upsetting experience for someone that doesn't have that I guess history with people living outside, and
Right,
so
right.
and so I think it's just really important to like be aware of like when you're being triggered and like when you need to back off, right? Because not every, I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's a tough one. It really is. I think I really do think though that mental health first aid would go a long way in this country in general, honestly, in workplaces, civic settings, etc.
Yeah.
You know, the stoplight interactions for me are a lot easier. I enjoy stoplight interactions in the sense that, like, you know, it's 102 today here in Austin, and the heat index is going to be, I think they said on the news, 112. One of the things that's really easy for me to do, and I struggle with like money, you know, what do I do? Like, how do I approach? But I've never had a single person turn down a bottle of water in Austin, Texas. And then it opens the door for that conversation, right? Like, hey, where, you know, do you have more, like, do y'all have water? You know, do you have any pets? Like, what's going on? Like, how are you doing out here? And I think just that humanizing connection with just talking to someone for a minute, I mean, can go a long way, and for both parties.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, like, if I do give cash or a card, like, I just give it to them, and what happens to it after that is really none of my business. I mean, because the one thing that I can be almost certain of is that they're not gonna use that for something that they don't want or need. You know what I mean? Like, whether that's something that I want or need, that is irrelevant. They're gonna use it for something that they want or need. And so whatever happens to it after that is none of my business.
Yeah, I definitely think especially the humanizing element. You know, so sometimes if you don't have anything to give, but you at least look somebody in the eyes and you know, give them a good God bless you, or like something nice, and is a lot more than just trying to ignore it. And I think that's a lot of the times what we're trying to do is not have to figure out what the right thing to do is, and as quick as possible get about our day and just keep going. In addition to that, what are some of the things that you might recommend people can do if they're interested and they want to get more involved in helping to fight homelessness? What are some of the things you can recommend, from, you know, volunteering to donating, some of the things that you would recommend people do?
Sure. Yeah, that's another good question. So something we haven't really talked about is how resources are allocated to communities to address homelessness from the federal government. And so that process happens through what's known as the point in time count, which is an annual or biannual, depending on the community that you live in, physical census of people experiencing homelessness in a given community. That process is largely volunteer-led. Like, those aren't paid people going out there to do that census work. And that's a really, I think, in terms of value for time, is something that could be very valuable for a community with a very limited time commitment, right? That is something that happens every January in most communities. And that's prescribed by the federal government. I have a feeling I know why they selected a January night to collect people that are living outside, but that's another conversation. But yeah, that I think the point in time count is something that your local continuum of care can connect you to. You could Google city name continuum of care, like Waco continuum of care. It'll tell you who is your continuum of care lead, and then from their website you should be able to find information about the point in time count. I think that one is again so valuable, because that is how resources are allocated, both from the Veterans Administration to address veteran homelessness, through HUD, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to address individual and family as well as youth homelessness. And it's really how planning efforts around homelessness are used up and down the administrative structure of government. So from your local city council all the way up to, the Secretary of HUD and Congress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say that's one way, right? And that's like a low barrier to entry. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's always a need for volunteers around like soup kitchens, stuff like that. I think the main thing is like not reinventing the wheel, right? Like chances are if you have thought like, I want to hand out sandwiches to people experiencing homelessness, I almost guarantee you there's 100 other people in your community that are also having a similar thought. And
Mm-hmm.
so what we don't need is 300 people experiencing homelessness and 1,700 sandwiches, right? Like that doesn't help the situation necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So I think getting plugged into the people that are already doing the work in your community and finding out what the need is.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen some really creative volunteer opportunities at service agencies though. Just things like hanging out with people, going to like sports games, like normalizing life, right? Like things that people don't get to do while they're homeless necessarily. I've seen some interesting stuff out of service agencies though.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, those are great. Those are great recommendations. And I had heard of the point in time count before, but it, not working with homelessness all the time, it's not something that is on the front of my mind. And that's a great recommendation. Well, I think it's a good time to start wrapping up. And I wrap up every episode with two things, going out and going deeper. So going out is an action step that people can take, and going deeper is a resource, a book or a movie, something that they can go deeper on this issue. And I'll go first while you're kind of thinking about yours. My going out, it goes along with what you were just sharing about volunteering in existing organizations. I was, I think, changed a lot by volunteering with a shelter when I lived in Chicago. Our church did volunteer shifts with a shelter that was at a Jewish temple, a synagogue. I was losing the word for what the Jewish temples are called. And I did a shift there and a couple different times. And then during seminary, when I was doing my mentoring semester, a big part of what I did every week was volunteering in a soup kitchen, helping just pass out meals and stuff like that. And both of those things were times where I got to interact and spend time with people who were experiencing homelessness beyond those encounters we talked about earlier, where they're asking for money or they're at a stoplight. And I remember seeing some of the same people and getting a chance to like talk to people. And that really, as we've been saying, humanizes. And so I also recommend that. Find those places in your community that are serving homeless populations, whether it's a soup kitchen or a shelter, and a place that you can help out and do it regularly enough that you get to actually build some relationships with people, because it does change how we think about the people that are experiencing homelessness. And so I would recommend that as an action step. Going deeper, the only thing that comes to mind for me, and I'm sure you've got some recommendations. There's a great book I remember reading when I was living at the World Hunger Relief Farm called When Helping Hurts. And it's just basically looking at poverty and our approaches to dealing with poverty. So it's not specifically about homelessness. And I'd love if you have a book or other recommendation on homelessness, understanding how our approaches sometimes are doing more harm than good. And we think we've kind of understood what would help, but we haven't thought through it because a lot of us aren't experts on poverty or homelessness or all of these different issues. And so it was really kind of unpacking our our approaches to dealing with poverty and finding things that are actually helpful. As you mentioned, this idea of the housing industrial complex, there's a whole complex around nonprofits and services that in some ways kind of benefits from things continuing from there still being a need for certain services and nonprofits. And even though the mission statements of all of those nonprofits probably talk about getting rid of the thing they're working on, in reality, they benefit from it continuing. And how do we, maybe unintentionally or subconsciously set things up so that we can keep having jobs and working in areas that are service, instead of finding solutions that kind of get rid of the need for some of those services. Anyway, so When Helping Hurts is a book that I would recommend for people to read on poverty. Jim, what are your two things, going out and going deeper?
Yeah, I think I'm not gonna just double dip on your recommendation to find a meaningful volunteer opportunity in your community. What I will say though is that there is a host of information, and in terms of like data around homelessness. So the National Alliance to End Homelessness is a great resource for folks. I would also say that the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness is getting ready to release their now third strategic plan to end homelessness. So I would encourage you to read what the administration is looking at to end homelessness and as we move forward into 2021 and beyond. And the reason that I would do that is because I feel like we have to be able to hold our elected officials accountable. This is, I don't want to say the industrial complex again in this podcast, right? But it's not just a failing of service providers; it's a failing of our elected officials. It's a
right.
One of the things that we have been talking about in Austin, right, is this idea of like defunding the police, and what that actually means is that those budgets have gotten so inflated versus the supportive services or the service dollars that could be supporting real social safety nets in our community. And so I would just encourage people to educate themselves more on what's coming down the pipe as far as the federal response on homelessness. Going deeper, there is actually, it's funny that you mentioned a book. I'll also mention a book. It's called The Book on Ending Homelessness. It was written by Ian DeJong, who designed a coordinated entry assessment tool that is used essentially throughout the United States to prioritize people for limited services and housing availability. But he has a really poignant takes on what we've been trying and what we need to try to do differently. So I would encourage people to educate themselves on what's really happening here, right? Because the path that we're on is not sustainable.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jim, for your time and your knowledge and sharing all those recommendations and really good information. This is a topic that I think there's a lot that we can do, and that I hope people feel a little bit encouraged, maybe that there are solutions, there are ways that we can help out, and ways that we can educate ourselves and advocate for policies and voting in our representatives who will take those kinds of approaches that are working. So thanks so much for spending your time with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for inviting me, Lucas. And if you ever want to have that conversation about housing first, just let me know.
Yeah, we might have to have you back and dig a little deeper. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Hope Fellowship Mennonite Church for their generous support of the podcast. Also, many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
Que le vaya bien.
A That's Not Gunner Productions podcast.